Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Stories 1. The Phantom Hitchhiker of Route 97. It was a cold and foggy night in late November, just a few days before Thanksgiving. The highway stretched out endlessly, shrouded in a blanket of mist that seemed almost alive. Jason Parker, a seasoned truck driver in his early 40s, was making his way down Oregon's Route 97, a route he had driven hundreds of times before. The road was quiet, eerily so, with only the occasional distant howl of the wind breaking the silence. Jason had just passed through the small town of Crescent, its dim streetlights fading in his rearview mirror. The forest that lined the highway seemed denser than usual, the towering pines pressing in on both sides like silent sentinels. He adjusted his radio, hoping for some music to keep him company, but all he got was static. The isolation was palpable. A few miles further, just as he approached a particularly sharp curve, his headlights caught something ahead on the side of the road. It was a figure, a woman, standing completely still, her silhouette barely visible through the fog. Jason instinctively slowed his truck, his heart pounding. It wasn't unusual to see hitchhikers on this stretch, but something about her made him uneasy. As his truck rolled closer, he noticed her clothes, a long, pale dress that seemed outdated, like something from the 1940s. Her hair was dark and damp, clinging to her face, and her eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto his even before he came to a stop. Jason hesitated for a moment. Every instinct told him to keep driving, but he knew how dangerous this stretch of road could be for someone on foot. Rolling down his window slightly, he called out, "Hey there! Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, as if trying to understand him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "South. I need to go south." Jason hesitated again, glancing at the empty passenger seat of his truck. Something about her presence sent a shiver down his spine, but he couldn't just leave her there. "All right," he finally said, unlocking the door. "Hop in. I'm heading south too." The woman climbed in silently, her movements slow and deliberate. As she settled into the seat, Jason couldn't help but notice how cold the air around her felt, even with the heater running full blast. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jason cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "Margaret," she replied, her voice as soft and distant as the fog outside. "Nice to meet you, Margaret." "I'm Jason," he said, forcing a smile. "So, where are you headed exactly?" But Margaret didn't answer. She simply raised a hand and pointed down the road. Stories 2. Lost on the shadowy roads of Tillamook Forest. It was just past midnight when Emily Davis found herself driving through the winding roads of Tillamook Forest in Oregon. She had spent the weekend visiting a friend in Portland and decided to take the scenic route back to her small hometown near the coast. She knew the forest roads well, or at least she thought she did. The late October air was crisp, and the dense canopy above blocked out the moonlight, leaving only her headlights to cut through the pitch-black night. The towering firs and cedars loomed on either side of the road, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Emily was tired but alert, gripping the steering wheel tightly as her car climbed a steep incline. The GPS on her phone had lost signal miles ago, and her only guide now was the faint memory of the route and the occasional road signs that appeared like ghosts in the darkness. Suddenly, the familiar road seemed to veer into unfamiliar territory. A fork appeared where she didn't remember there being one before. The left path was paved but narrow, while the right looked like a dirt road, overgrown with weeds and leading deeper into the forest. She frowned, slowing to a stop and leaning forward to peer through the windshield. "This can't be right," she muttered to herself, glancing at the clock on her dashboard. It read 12:23 a.m. Emily decided to take the left path, reasoning that the paved road was more likely to lead her back to the highway. As she drove, a heavy mist began to roll in, clinging to the road like a living thing. The beams of her headlights barely penetrated the thick fog, and her sense of unease grew with each passing minute. Then she saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the haze. It was a man, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned work clothes, suspenders, a flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat. He was facing away from her, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening for something. Emily's heart raced. She slowed her car to a crawl, debating whether to stop or keep driving. As she drew closer, the man suddenly turned to face her, and her breath caught in her throat. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, but it was his expression that unnerved her the most. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, as if she wasn't really there. Emily's foot hovered over the gas pedal, and for a moment, she thought about stopping to ask if he needed help. But before she could make a decision, the man turned abruptly and walked into the forest, disappearing into the thick wall of trees. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, glancing nervously into her rearview mirror. The fog seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around her car like a shroud. She pressed on, her stomach twisting with unease, when suddenly, her radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, followed by a faint, distant voice. "Turn around," it whispered. Emily's blood ran cold. Stories 3. Truck driver's nightmare on the icy Oregon Pass. It was a bitterly cold night in early December, and the snowstorm showed no signs of letting up. Ben Carter, a long-haul trucker with 20 years of experience, was hauling a load of timber through Oregon's treacherous Santiam Pass. He'd driven through snow many times before, but tonight felt different. The storm seemed angry, its icy winds howling like wolves and rattling the sides of his rig. The clock on his dashboard read 1:42 a.m. as he carefully navigated the winding mountain road. His headlights cut through the falling snow, illuminating the steep drop-offs to his right and the towering pines on his left. The CB radio had gone silent hours ago, and the isolation was starting to wear on him. Ben reached for his thermos, hoping a sip of coffee would help him stay sharp, when his truck suddenly hit a patch of black ice. The rig skidded slightly, and his heart jumped. He tightened his grip on the wheel, muttering a curse under his breath. "Stay focused, Ben. Just a few more miles to the rest stop," he said aloud, trying to calm himself. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights caught something strange ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Ben slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the icy pavement. The truck came to a shuddering halt just feet away from the person. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes that looked soaked through, his face pale and gaunt. He wasn't wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperatures, and his thin frame seemed almost translucent in the headlights. Ben rolled down his window slightly, the frigid air biting at his skin. "Hey, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at Ben with an expression that was impossible to read. Was it fear, anger, or something else entirely? Ben hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay in the truck. But the man looked so frail, so out of place, that he couldn't ignore him. "Hang on, I'll come help you," Ben called, switching on his hazard lights before stepping out into the snow. The cold was brutal, and the wind whipped around him as he approached the man. "What are you doing out here?" Ben asked, raising his voice over the storm. The man tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and hollow. Ben froze. There was something off about the man's tone, something that sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "What do you mean?" Ben asked, taking a cautious step back. Before the man could answer, the sound of tires screeching behind him made Ben whirl around. Another truck was skidding down the icy road, its headlights barreling toward them. Stories 4. The Vanishing Car on Crater Lake Highway. It was a warm summer evening in July, the kind of night where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of a clear sky full of stars. Sarah and her boyfriend, Mike, were driving along Crater Lake Highway after spending the day hiking near the famous lake. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the road illuminated only by the silvery glow of the moon and the steady beam of their car's headlights. The highway was eerily quiet, with no other cars in sight. The dense forest seemed to press in on either side, the towering trees casting long, jagged shadows that danced in the moonlight. Sarah leaned her head against the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she absent-mindedly traced shapes with her finger. "Not a bad day, huh?" Mike said, breaking the silence. He glanced at her with a grin, his hands steady on the wheel. "Yeah," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "It's just this road feels weird. Like it's too empty, you know?" Mike chuckled. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Sarah. What did you expect, a traffic jam?" She laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Something about the stillness outside felt off, almost oppressive. She shook the feeling off and turned her attention back to the road. That's when she saw it, a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror, appearing out of nowhere. "Mike, there's a car behind us," Sarah said, sitting up straighter. He glanced at the mirror and frowned. "Where'd they come from? We haven't seen anyone for miles." The car behind them was an old model, a 1950 sedan with rounded edges and a chrome grille that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Its headlights burned bright, but the driver didn't seem in any hurry to overtake them, keeping a steady distance instead. Mike slowed down slightly, pulling to the side to let the car pass, but it didn't. The sedan mirrored their movements, staying directly behind them. "That's weird," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike nodded, his jaw tightening. Maybe they're just nervous about passing on a dark road. He tapped the brake lights, a signal for the other car to go ahead, but still it stayed back. Sarah turned to look through the rear window, her heart pounding. "Mike, I don't think there's anyone driving it." "What are you talking about?" he asked, glancing in the mirror again. "No, I mean it. Look," she insisted. Mike squinted at the rearview mirror. The headlights were bright, but she was right. There was no discernible figure behind the wheel. A chill ran down his spine. That's impossible. The sedan's headlights flickered, then dimmed slightly, as if the car itself was responding to their growing fear. "Mike, just drive. Don't stop. Don't slow down," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Mike didn't argue. He pressed the gas, speeding up as the forest blurred around them. The sedan followed, its engine silent, its headlights unwavering. Stories 5. Echoes of screams on the abandoned road to Alvord Desert. It was late September, and the desert air was unusually still as Alex McAllister drove his dusty Jeep Wrangler along the old, nearly forgotten road to Alvord Desert in southeastern Oregon. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving the sprawling desert cloaked in darkness. Alex had been on the road for hours, hoping to find a good spot for stargazing and camping. But now, he was starting to regret leaving the main highway. The road was barely more than a dirt trail, riddled with potholes and lined with sparse sagebrush. His headlights cast long, flickering shadows, making the landscape feel even more desolate. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, 11:47 p.m. Almost there, Alex muttered to himself, though he wasn't entirely sure if that was true. His GPS had lost signal miles ago, and the last sign of civilization had been a crumbling gas station, its windows boarded up. The night was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no insects, just the steady hum of his engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. Then out of nowhere, he heard it, a scream. Alex slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound had been faint but unmistakable, cutting through the silence like a knife. He rolled down his window, the dry desert air flooding in. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. "Nothing." Alex waited, his ears straining for any hint of movement. After a few moments of silence, he shook his head and started to drive again. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he whispered, trying to convince himself. But a few minutes later, he heard it again, louder this time. A high-pitched, blood-curdling scream echoing across the barren landscape. Alex's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he scanned the road ahead. In the faint beam of his headlights, he saw something. A figure. It was a woman, standing in the middle of the road, her back to him. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that billowed slightly in the cool night air. Her long, dark hair hung loose, obscuring her face. "Are you kidding me?" Alex muttered, his pulse racing. He slowed the Jeep to a crawl, stopping about 20 feet from her. His first instinct was to help, but something about the way she stood, so unnaturally still, sent chills down his spine. "Hey, are you okay?" he called, leaning out of the window. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. Alex hesitated, then reached for the flashlight in his glove compartment. Steeling himself, he stepped out of the Jeep, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Ma'am, do you need help?" he asked, his voice carrying into the emptiness. As he took a cautious step closer, the woman finally moved. She tilted her head to the side, just slightly, as if listening to something only she could hear. Alex froze. The scream came again, louder than before, but it didn't come from her. It came from behind him. Story 6. The ghostly warning on the misty Oregon coastline. The clock struck 10:15 p.m. As Rachel drove her aging Subaru Outback along the winding Oregon Coast Highway. The rhythmic crashing of waves against the rocky cliffs below was muffled by a thick layer of fog that clung to the coastline. It was late October, and the air carried a damp chill that seeped through even the thickest layers. Rachel had spent the weekend visiting a friend in Astoria and was now heading back home to Florence. She had planned to leave earlier in the day, but one thing after another had delayed her, and now she found herself alone on this desolate stretch of highway. The headlights of her car barely cut through the dense mist, creating an eerie, otherworldly glow around her. The road ahead was empty, save for the occasional weathered sign warning of sharp turns and steep drop-offs. Rachel couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing in her chest since she left Astoria. It wasn't unusual for the highway to feel isolating at night, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow. As she rounded a particularly sharp curve, her high beams illuminated something ahead, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Rachel's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively slowed the car. It was a man, wearing a dark raincoat and a wide-brimmed hat, standing perfectly still. His head was slightly bowed, and his hands were clasped in front of him. Rachel hesitated. She wasn't one to pick up hitchhikers, but the man didn't look like he was trying to flag her down. Instead, he seemed almost out of place. As her car crept closer, she noticed the man's raincoat was dry, an odd detail considering the damp mist that had been falling steadily for hours. Rachel rolled down her window slightly, keeping one hand on the steering wheel. "Hey, are you okay?" she called out, her voice tinged with caution. The man slowly lifted his head, revealing a face that was pale and weathered, with eyes that seemed far too dark for the faint light of her high beams. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "Turn back," he said, his words cutting through the heavy fog. Rachel frowned. "What?" "You need to turn back. There's danger ahead," the man repeated, his tone unwavering. Her unease deepened, but she couldn't help her curiosity. "What are you talking about? What danger?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, disappearing into the mist as though he had never been there. Rachel's hands tightened on the wheel as a chill ran down her spine. Her instinct screamed at her to heed the warning, but another part of her, a rational, skeptical part, dismissed the encounter as a strange coincidence. She glanced at her phone. No service. Of course. Taking a deep breath, she decided to keep driving. She told herself it was just a local trying to spook her, maybe someone who'd had a bit too much to drink. But the further she drove, the thicker the fog became, until it felt like her car was floating in a sea of gray. And then she saw it. Just beyond the next curve, the faint outline of a massive fallen tree blocked the road. Rachel slammed on the brakes, her tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. She came to a stop just feet from the trunk, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the obstacle in shock, realizing that if she hadn't slowed down, she would have crashed into it at full speed. Story 7. Haunted Hitchhiker on the Rogue River Road. It was late spring, just past midnight, when Kevin Morgan found himself driving down the lonely Rogue River Road in southern Oregon. He had just finished a long shift at a construction site in Grants Pass and was heading back to his cabin near Gold Beach. The winding road snaked along the Rogue River, the moonlight shimmering faintly on the water through gaps in the dense pine forest. Kevin was exhausted, but the rhythmic hum of his truck's engine and the cool night air kept him alert. His old FM radio crackled with static, interrupted occasionally by faint snatches of music or a muffled voice. He didn't bother tuning it. The road was empty, as it often was this time of night. Kevin liked the quiet, but tonight it felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were watching him. Shadows danced along the road, cast by his headlights, and every so often, he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. At 12:37 a.m., Kevin spotted something unusual up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. As he got closer, the figure came into focus. A young woman in a pale blue dress, her long blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She stood perfectly still, one arm raised in a gesture that was unmistakable. She was hitchhiking. Kevin slowed his truck, glancing around the deserted road. It was odd to see anyone out here at this hour, especially someone on foot. He rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of her and leaned over to roll down the passenger side window. "Need a ride?" he called out. The woman nodded, her face obscured by her hair. She stepped closer to the truck, moving with an almost unnatural grace, and opened the passenger door. "Thanks," she said softly as she climbed in. Kevin noticed her bare feet, pale and dusty against the truck's floor mat. He didn't ask any questions right away. People had their reasons for being out here, and he figured she'd speak up when she was ready. As they drove, the silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional bump of the road beneath the tires. Finally, Kevin cleared his throat. "So, where you headed?" he asked, keeping his tone light. She hesitated before answering. "Just a little further down the road." Her voice was calm but distant, as if she were distracted by something only she could see. Kevin nodded, his eyes flicking toward her briefly. "All right. Bit of a strange time to be out here. Everything okay?" The woman turned her head slowly to look at him, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. "I had to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kevin felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain why, but something about her words made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. "Leave from where?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the road ahead, her hands resting neatly in her lap. The silence grew heavier, and Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He glanced at her again, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. After a few miles, she spoke again. "Be careful on this road," she said. Kevin frowned. "Why's that?" She didn't respond right away. Then, in that same soft, distant voice, she said, "There's a bend up ahead. People don't always see it in time." Kevin nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I've driven this road plenty of times. I know the spot you're talking about." But as they approached the bend she mentioned, something strange happened. Kevin's headlights flickered, dimming for a moment before flaring back to life. The road ahead seemed darker, the trees closing in like a tunnel. He slowed the truck instinctively, his pulse quickening. Then he realized he couldn't hear the woman breathing anymore. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Have a good night and sweet dreams. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss the next chilling tale. See you soon.